Okay. Now, yeah, it's going to be recorded. Let me move this over. And I guess I'll just, I don't know if I can full screen it from here. Oh, wait. Okay. Guess I'll just like do this. All right, Jeff, you are live as far as I can tell.
Okay, yeah, no, it looks like I am live. I can see the little
You see
live logo on the. Yes, how's it going, everyone?
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Hopefully we'll have some people show up in the chat. We had 40 people RSVP, and I don't know where people are. Probably stuck in Portland traffic because Portland traffic is awful.
That's all right. First of all, I do have to tell you guys that I absolutely love Portland. I've only been there once in my life, but I was there for about a week for a vacation when I lived in California about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was one of the best vacations I ever had. I miraculously, oh, Julian, you might want to mute your side until there's questions, just so there's not the feedback loop.
Okay. I don't know how.
Oh, I got it. I got you. Okay, so yeah, like I was saying, I was in Portland for a week. I thought it was great. It was probably a miracle that for the entire week I was there, I think it only rained like one day, which I hear that is very rare around there. But food was amazing. My wife and I decided one night to go on a pub crawl and try to go to every bar that we saw, every brewery, and get like a flight of beer. And I don't think we made it past like 2 blocks or something like that. So just love that place. I definitely want to come back. You guys are definitely very lucky. So I don't have many visual cues. If you guys have like questions during the presentation, definitely just come up and like unmute, and definitely I can stop to answer anything. This is not going to be a formal talk. It's more of a fireside chat. I want to talk a little bit about my experience with server-side rendering in Angular, and we'll get into some of the background, some of the motivations, some of the history, and then we'll get into like a little bit of code to show how it works, and then I'll talk about where it's going from here. All right. So just from a show of hands, how many of you guys have used Angular Universal before, server-side rendering with Angular? Oh, all right. A couple of people. That's great. That's awesome. So for you guys, some of this beginning part you've probably seen before, been rudimentary, but hopefully I'll get into a couple kind of tricks and that type of thing later on. And I'm definitely up for answering any questions that come up in the meantime. So we're going to bounce around between a couple different presentations that I have. I'm just going to switch to share my screen. Give me a second. Okay. So first of all, just a quick kind of introduction. So in addition to working on the Angular project, I'm also CTO of a company called GetHuman that helps people with customer service problems. Basically, if you don't want to call a company and deal with an issue, you can use some of our free tools, or pay us to do it. We have kind of really popular service for just kind of lowering all your bills. We kind of call and haggle with all the companies to get them to give you the best deals, and that usually works out pretty well. So check that out. But I also bring this up because this site is server rendered with Angular. So if you click around and let's just go somewhere. I mean, there's it's client and server side. So some of obviously the drop down and that type of thing is client side functionality. But you see that it loads extremely quickly. And when I click around, if I refresh the page, it is always very fast. And let's just go to a, actually the real test is when you come from search engine. So the typical way people come to our site is if you do, let's do Facebook customer service. And oops, phone number. There. So right there, and then when you click, so it shows up very quickly. So that was the basic use case of where this all started from. Many years ago, like during the beginnings of the Angular 1 days, 1.0 days, in fact. That was when I first started using Angular and working on this project. And at that time, this site was built in PHP. And it was something where we wanted to add a lot of rich user interface features, but we also wanted, SEO was very important. As you kind of saw, I just did a Google search for a Facebook phone number, and we were in the top 5 of the search rankings. So making sure that we stayed high in the search rankings was important, and there was no solution out there really for isomorphic, what's called isomorphic or universal rendering on the server, so that search engines can more easily see it. There wasn't any good solutions back then in 2012 around. Backbone had something called Render, which was very clunky and not easy to use, and there wasn't really much else. So basically, I built an Angular 1 solution for server rendering, which was very customized, and it worked great. But it wasn't something that I could share. I thought to share it with everybody at some point, but it was just so highly customized for us that we never ended up doing it. So this is the original design doc for Angular 2 or whatever, Angular universal server rendering. At ngConf 2 years ago, I met Patrick JS, if you guys have heard of him, and Tobias from the Angular core team. And basically we just had a common interest in this. So I kind of dropped my Angular 1 solution, customized solution, and we all started working together on this. So this was the original, and all these links I'm going to include and send you guys, so you don't have to write it down. But if you were ever interested in the very original designs where, and I do a comparison to the other solutions out there, and a lot of this is outdated. I haven't updated this in forever, but it might be an interesting read if that's the type of thing you guys like to do on a Friday night or whatever, read design docs. But so we did a number of presentations, and I'm going to pick a couple of key pieces from some of the presentations we've done to kind of illustrate a couple of points. So this was one of the first ones we gave, once we came out with Angular Universal, and basically talking about the primary uses. There's actually a couple other edge cases, reasons why you would want to use server rendering as well, but these are kind of the big ones. Link preview, that when you're pasting a link into Facebook or Twitter or any other social media, then if you have a client-side only rendered app, it doesn't actually show up. So as much as it's great with progressive web apps and Google being able to index client-side apps to some degree, it's not perfect, but they do it. For the large part, social sharing is not able to do it, and they only do server rendered apps. So for when you care about sharing links, typically you need server rendering. SEO, this is one thing that has been debated for a long time. I feel like I talk about this, kind of have a discussion at different conferences, and it's gotten more so because there's always a strong belief that among certain groups that if the client side loads very fast, especially when you're using something like progressive web app, then being able to use Service Worker to cache some of the calls to the server side then why do you need server rendering? And the two things that I always point to whenever anybody says that is that, number one, no matter how fast the client side can load, it's never, ever going to be as fast as a server rendered view when it's done properly. So just in terms of raw speed, especially for the initial load, even when you have service worker, the initial load, it doesn't actually help. It's always for subsequent loads. So when you're dealing with users out on the public internet who are just coming to your site for the first time from search engine links, it is really important that it loads fast. In fact, actually, even though people get too caught up in search engines and how they work, but in reality, search engines it's not as much about gaming the search engine robot, because search engines place most of their signals of positive signals that your site should rank highly off of the behavior of users. So it's more about gearing. SEO is really about making your site great for users, and making your site great for users in this case means when somebody is on a lower powered device in a remote region, with Wi-Fi, where the Wi-Fi is really spotty, it still needs to load quickly. And if you have a really efficient server view that's edge cached, then it will, regardless of your client-side app and everything. So, and then the search engines see that. They see that people are getting to your site and staying there and not bouncing. And that's what increases your SEO. And then the other thing is that even though the Google search crawler has gotten pretty good at indexing client-side rendered apps, it's not perfect. If you look at it, like it's definitely has some holes in it. That it will always be the case, just because it's tough to know when a client-side app is quote unquote stable. That's the snapshot to take. But also, it's because Google, even though Google is dominant, it's not the only search engine, and the other search engines aren't nearly as good at capturing client-side only rendered apps. So SEO is still important. And then progressive enhancement has to do with just when somebody is on a older browser or a device that either is really slow or just can't render certain things. Client-side JavaScript, run certain client-side JavaScript, having that server view is a really good fallback. I don't actually do this, but I know depending on if you have a content site, for example, and one thing that you can do is if you have a content site and you want to service like IE8 users for some silly reason, and there actually still is a pretty good amount of people out there with IE8. What you could do is actually just turn off your client-side rendering and just give them the server view, and then typically that should work. And then the other thing is that so really the thing that server rendering attempts to address, and in particular the Angular solution, is this thing called the web app gap that I came up with a year or two ago. And what that means is that if you look at the initial page load, that there's a couple different parts to that. There's a server response, initial server response, and then your assets are downloaded, like your CSS and JavaScript if you aren't lazy loading them. And then there's the JavaScript is parsed, client side is initialized, and then the client side might pull data and then finally paint. And that could take a while. So if you want to have like a snappy site that appears quickly, and this can appear, take 3 to 7 seconds, which is, or more on really slow devices. And that's a problem because, for a lot of publicly facing site, that means the difference of even hundreds of milliseconds means more people bouncing, less people buying your product or doing whatever you want them to do on your site. So there's a lot of studies. This is one from Filament Group. There's a lot of studies that Google has put out, and et cetera, that show that any sort of speed performance increase helps the usability of your site and ultimately your search ranking, and kind of feeds on itself. So there's different ways to deal with this. I'm gonna skip through some of this. Yeah. Okay. So the thing I wanted to mention here is that in addition to Angular Universal being able to render the server side, which we'll get into that, in a minute. The other part of the solution for Angular is this thing called preboot. So preboot deals with the time from when the user first sees the server view until the client view takes over. Because when the server view first shows up, there is still going to be, there's always going to be a gap there, because the browser has to see the reference for the client-side JavaScript, download it, load it up, and then it kind of takes over the page. If you don't have a server view, then the user just is seeing nothing. But even if you have a server view, there's kind of a gap there. And there's, if you look at the different server rendering solutions out there with React, with Ember, there's a lot of different ones out there. They have a different philosophy for how this transition takes place. And it's one thing that for Angular, we have a certain way that works now that I'll explain, but it is something that there's little parts to this that we're constantly tweaking, because depending on your use case, there are plus and minuses to the different options. So the way it works for Angular today is that the server view appears on the screen, and if you are not using preboot, so if you're just doing Angular Universal, the platform server, and then you just have the client viewing over, what's going to happen is the client view would just completely blow away the server view and just replace it. And if everything kind of matches up, like it'll be mostly fine, but to be honest, you do see like a little bit of a flash most times, because you are kind of like, you're essentially redrawing the entire page. React with this deals with this issue by trying to what's called hydrate, by keeping the server view and then just attaching the client view to the server view. There's some problems with doing that with Angular because of AOT. We are kind of like looking into some options, but the solution that we have right now is with preboot, where what happens is preboot creates a buffer, like a hidden buffer, and the client view, instead of blowing away the server view, the client view actually gets rendered to a hidden, like off-screen buffer. And once it's stable, like so that word stable, what that means in terms of Angular, like if you guys have heard that before with protractor or other things in the Angular world, when somebody says that the app is stable, what they're saying is that the rendering is complete and any asynchronous events have finished. It basically goes through like all its initial round of asynchronous events, usually like calls to the server and that type of thing. So once the app is quote unquote stable, then preboot will switch the server view and the client view. Now, the one advantage that preboot has over the hydration solution that like React has is that preboot will actually record. There's inline JavaScript in the server view that records all of the events, like a button click or typing in a text box or whatever else, and then actually replays all of those events to the client view. So even if you click on a button, well, the server view is being displayed, the client view will actually process that once it's ready. So that's pretty cool. That's something that I honestly have not seen out there with any of the other libraries. So that's something that is kind of unique to Angular with the current implementation. Okay. Let me switch to this. So one thing, it's server rendering, Angular Universal is not for everyone. There's a lot of use cases where it honestly doesn't matter. So it's basically, if you care about any of these three things, do you care about the initial load time? Do you care about SEO? Do you care about social links? I mean, if you do in any case, then yes. So it doesn't have to be publicly facing sites. Usually SEO and social links are only for publicly facing sites, but there's actually plenty of internal apps that benefit because of the initial load time, that the internal users actually like the fact that when they go to the app that it's instantly there and everything like that. So depending on your use case. But if you don't, then no, you shouldn't. I mean, it's an extra added area of complexity that if you don't need it, then I wouldn't. In my projects at work, I only use server rendering for stuff that's actually fitting in one of these 3 categories. And let me fast forward to the end here. Yeah, so sorry. So with the Angular Universal Solution, I talked about pre-boot and the gap event. So these are kind of like three unique things for the Angular solution that's different, frankly different than the other frameworks, either React or Ember or Vue that's out there. So just talking about these briefly, I already talked about pre-boot. You guys probably know a little bit about Zone, or at least seen it. Hopefully you haven't been bitten by zone-related issue too much with Angular. But on the server, it actually helps a tremendous amount, because one of the problems with server rendering with trying to take a client-side app and server render it is that you don't know when, like I mentioned, stable, right? Like you don't know when it's stable. The way that traditionally, I have not honestly looked at the latest version of React, the React Fiber and the way they're doing it, but at least before React Fiber, the server-side rendering had to be synchronous. So it basically, there were potential issues with scalability, because once you tried to render a page, there wasn't any the rendering components at all happened at once, and it basically blocked the event queue. And so a lot of people who implemented React server rendering, and again, I don't know if this is still the case, but at least it was about a year ago, a year, 8 months ago, that because it was blocking the event queue, then you typically couldn't scale past like a dozen or so simultaneous requests, and people had to typically have a pretty robust server setup or heavily use caching, edge caching, in order to get the server rendered part working. With Zone, basically it allows asynchronous rendering of individual components, and you just basically, with calls to the back end, it's all kept track of by the zone. So like there's a zone that encapsulates the entire server rendering side, and it will keep track of every single asynchronous event that occurs, and it will wait until all those asynchronous events complete. Now that's like in my Angular 1 solution, like this you guys don't have to care about this, because this is one of these things that happen behind the scenes, but just kind of for your own knowledge, with my Angular 1 server rendered solution, like I had to actually specifically chain all the asynchronous events to make sure that the server response didn't occur until they were all complete, and it was a big pain. Just being able to kind of take an app and just plop it onto the server and have it work and have the app know when it's ready to send back that response is really huge, and that's because of Zone. And then dependencies, I'm going to show an example in a little bit, but DI, in my mind, is a real plus when it comes to server rendering, because it allows you to write the same code to run in both places, but have different, like the same interface, but then different implementations. And I'm going to show an example of like how that is really a major advantage when it comes to writing for both the client and the server. All right. I'm switching around to just a couple different presentations before I get to the code. So this one, there was just one thing I wanted to point out here. So in addition to all that I just said, there's one other thing that comes at it from a different angle, but it's just one thing to kind of throw out there in terms of, why an advantage that I thought about, but I didn't realize how great it really was, that when you use the same code on the server and the client, there's a lot of simplicity that comes from basically same technology, same language, allowing we actually take it a step further, and not just the web server and then the web client for the app. We've actually taken a lot of the Angular concepts and use it for our API even. Like, so our API is written in Node, but it uses Angular DI, and it uses TypeScript, and it uses a lot of like the Angular conventions for the API, which sounds kind of weird, but my point here, this presentation is about full stack Angular, and it's about when you try to simplify your technical stack onto a smaller set of things, you don't have as many. In some environments, I know there's like kind of committees to kind of like try to decide new technology, and there's fights between people, different groups who want to do different things. Like there's sort of a simplicity depending on your environment to just say, no, we're just going to use X for everything. And some people like that, some people don't. So like, I'm not saying that that's for everybody, but I can just say for the people that I've worked with, that has been, plus. It kind of removes contention between, for making certain decisions. Context switching, just trying to switch between Java code on the back end and then JavaScript code on the front end. When you're just using like the same thing and it looks and feels the same, there a lot less context switching, and to some degree code duplication, that you're able to share more code. Oh, this was just, yeah. I'll include all these links, like I said. This is pre-boot. Okay. Let's switch to, well, I'm going to share out. Sorry, I'm switching to my code editor. Actually, before I do this, get to the code, maybe I want to just take a quick break, Julian, and does anybody have any kind of questions or thoughts or comments? Just so what I've gone over is just kind of like some of the history, concepts, and then I'm going to get into the code. But before I do that, anybody have any questions or thoughts or comments?
Anybody have any questions so far? No? Yes? Now's your chance.
Is it making sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Good, good. Okay, I will continue then. All right. So the example I'm going to give you, so most of my code that I've been working on is for like a really complex project, and there's a lot of cruft in there that's just going to like, will distract from what I'm trying to teach. So the example I'm going to give is actually in my pre-boot library. So this is part of our end-to-end test. And what I had to do here, so there's a lot of like different variations and different slight tweaks in the way that you can use Angular Universal. So I'm going to explain one way, and I'll try to like explain some of the differences of different ways as well. So in this case, all that I'm doing is I'm creating in this case, I'm actually generating static HTML at build time. So like with Angular Universal, you can either at runtime as part of Express generate a HTML on the fly, or you can at build time generate the HTML and then serve up the static HTML. So this is serving up the static HTML, but I'll explain where it would be slightly different. So here's the.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes.
Hey, could you zoom in on your code?
Oh, yes. Yes. Apologies.
Thanks.
Yeah, no
Awesome.
problem.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So this is, I mean, a very basic Express server. So I'm sure you guys have seen Express servers before. There's not too much to it. And I'll explain how this will be different if you wanted to do runtime rendering. But at least in this particular case, I'm doing kind of static rendering. So it's just serving up the static HTML. So let's see how that's actually generated. So this, just like you have with Angular, a browser module and your browser kind of main, which we'll go over the browser side in a second. I'm going to go over the server side first. There's a similar set of files for the browser side. Basically what it comes down to is you have a separate file for starting up your browser and server, and a separate file for your server module and your browser module. But then for the actual root component, that should be exactly the same. That's where your code kind of converges. So if I look at this code, I'm gonna, one thing I like to do with my examples, like, so I purposely picked this one because it's like very simple. Like it doesn't have like all the other stuff like I mentioned. And I like to kind of like try to like explain as much as I can line by line. Definitely let me know if there's questions as we kind of go through this. So, like I said, app component, we're going to get into that into a second, but the app component is exactly the same app component for both the server side and the client side. The imports are different. So this is where, like when you're starting up your app, it will do different things basically. On the browser side that you use. Actually, I'm importing it here. I'm not really using it, so I can take this out. But on the browser side, you're using the browser module, but on the server side, you're using the server module. Pretty simple. There's also optionally, so you don't have to use preboot. Preboot is an optional thing to just help with that transition from server side to clients to the browser side to the client side. But if you do want to use it, you have to include this separate module, and you tell it that to basically start recording events, and tell it what the app root is. In this case, I'm not minifying the code. What this actually does is this will generate inline JavaScript, so an optimized, very small set of inline JavaScript that's stuck into the server view that starts recording events, and then kind of holds it on the window, like in an object on the window for the browser once the browser is ready. And then providers. So in general, one of the tricks for server rendering, for universal rendering, I mentioned DI is like a huge advantage. And that's because you get to use the same interface with different implementations. So in this case, I have like a simple thing that where I can detect the platform and then have something different. I'm like printing this out in my component. You'll see that my component injects this and then displays it. But similarly, whenever, like, one of the most common questions that people have is, oh, I have some code that I'm either jQuery or I have to directly touch the DOM, like not use, I'm using the window directly for some reason or another, even though really you should try to avoid that and use the Angular APIs. But for whatever reason, you're need to touch the DOM, and it basically doesn't work something doesn't work on the server side. And in most cases, if it's something, there's basically two steps to the solution for like 90% of those problems. Step one is to get your code out of the component. Like your component, if at all possible, should only contain, I'll get to the component in a second, but basically it should only contain bindings. In an ideal case, this is just like a somewhat philosophical thing, but it will make your life easier. To not put any logic at all there, to only put kind of like, make it dumb, make your components dumb if at all possible. Just bindings and event bubbling, and that's it. I'm a big fan of NGRX, okay, or Redux or any of those types of libraries, because it allows you to push most of your code to services. And when you do that, then you can do something like this, where I'm just going to type it underneath here just to illustrate the example, but obviously in most cases you would have this in separate files. So if you had like some sort of, like, let's say you had a service that was like a food service that had a function display message string, and let's say it did like window.alert, or actually no, you don't. Here you wouldn't want to do that. So here, let's say it's just nothing, and then you do class. You usually wouldn't put this in the same file, but I'm just doing this here just to illustrate the point. Server. So typically, this is the way you do it. Is that on the server, it would be console.log, whereas here, you could do like window.alert. You almost never want to actually do this for many different reasons. But the point, and also it wouldn't really work here because you're still actually referencing this on the server side code. But just imagine that you separate this out into the separate files and whatever. And then here you can do provide foo service, use value, foo service server. So when you do this, then you basically inject foo service all over the place, and you can use that. And in all your components and everywhere else you do it, it just knows the interface foo service, and you just call that, and that works on any platform. If you implemented, and this is not just the browser and server. If you use Ionic, if you use NativeScript, if you use Electron, those are all different platforms. And typically the platforms might have a platform-specific code, right? But typically when you're the code you want to reference, you want it to be universal. You want it to be able to run anywhere. So this is kind of like the typical pattern that you implement. It's got to be a class. You can't do interface because interface can't be a provider. But essentially, you just have it as a class that just doesn't do anything. Like there's methods, like it's defining the interface basically. It's an abstract class almost. And then your actual implementations are for the different platforms. Like obviously, a universal implementation without splitting it out, then that's cool. But the point is, when you need to have some code that is browser specific, this is the way you want to ideally kind of split it out. Does that? Okay. And delete this. And then let me go to let's go to, and then I'll do the generator. Okay. So this component, I mean, there's really nothing to it. All it's doing is it's injecting that current platform. If you remember, we set it to server view, and obviously in the client view, it's setting it to client view. And so this same exact code is used on both the client and the server, but different things will be displayed on each. So that's pretty simple. This is a super, super simple app. And then the last thing on the server side to show is, so there's this code for generating, so this is where it's different for if you're doing generating static HTML at build time versus using Express to do it at runtime. So this is just a simple way. This is using a specific, don't pay attention, this that's just needed in order to use the JIT compiler. Don't pay attention too much to that. In most cases, just like the browser side uses Bootstrap module, Platform Browser Dynamic, Bootstrap module. There's something similar on the server side you can use. In this particular case, I just am interested in generating some static HTML. So the render module factory coming from platform server is kind of the key here. And in this case, I'm just inlining. This is the server template. But if usually you have this in an external file, I just have it here for simplicity's sake. And typically you do have to set the URL. And then in this case, again, I'm just doing it statically where I actually, just by doing this, like using the render module, that will output, it basically takes the URL. So this URL is used actually when, I don't actually, in this simple example, I am not using the Angular router, but if on the server side I had the Angular router in use, this URL would affect what was actually rendered in the app root, because the router would take that URL and then obviously render the appropriate component. So out of this comes the H string of the HTML. And then in this particular case, I'm just outputting that to a file. Now, you can do something, if you wanted to go back to the server code, the actual Express server, basically, I don't have the code here, but the gist of it, and if you look at the Angular Universal Starter, this is what it does, is it basically uses a Express engine, so instead of the express.static, it will, for all intents and purposes, do this and generate the HTML. And then instead of sending to a file, it'll do res.send and send it back to the server. So in that way, it'll kind of generate it on the fly. All right, so that's the server side. The one thing to mention, the client side, let's actually get the browser module. So the key thing with the browser module, so one thing is that typically for most of your just browser-only apps that you don't have server rendering, you would just import the browser module. But we will use with server transition, that sort of indicates that it's taking over for a server view. And then the preboot, just like if we go back to the, so the preboot on the server side starts recording events in the server view. Now we replay them. So this will, it basically waits until that app is stable, and then switches the server and client views, and then replays all the events. And just like you saw on the server side, we're just setting a different value for this token. So let me take another quick break here and see whether there are any questions.
I think everybody's good, Jeff.
Okay, cool.
Thanks.
All right. Let me go back to my thing. Oh, I got to share this. Sorry. I'm switching to a different screen. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about where we are right now. So there just was, if you guys, any of you follow me on Twitter or have been kind of keeping an eye on a lot of the stuff that's been coming out recently, there's actually the past 2 weeks, there have been a flurry of new updates, new stuff, and it's actually pretty cool because, to be honest, there was like a couple months where we were just building stuff. Like, you know, and when I say we, really it's more on the Google core team. This one guy, Vikram, if you guys have never heard of him, and Alex Rickabaugh, they have taken over the project. Before Jeff Cross was working on it, and Jeff left to do his own kind of consultancy. So Vikram and Alex Rickabaugh are kind of like Vikram's the head of the project, and Alex does a lot of work as well. And then from the community, Patrick JS and I still do some stuff, but to be honest, we both have been kind of like step back a little bit. And Jason Jean and Mark Pizek, a couple other people have kind of stepped up. And so the past 2 weeks, after a couple months of development, a bunch of different stuff. So one thing that I did was that I did get to update the 5.0 release of Preboot. Basically, there's a whole bunch of fixes, and you know, one of the cool things with this, besides making it just like a better interface, more stable, faster, everything like that, is that it actually works with any client-side and server-side technology. So I specifically built it in a way that it works really well with Angular, but you can use it with anything, with AngularJS, with React, with Vue, etc. And actually, there are a bunch of people, in fact, that are using it in those other frameworks as well. It works, you know, really well for any JavaScript. So that was pretty good. They went out last week. This service came out a little while ago. This was back in April, really in March. But it's something a lot. Basically, you know, when you're one of the things, let me go back to, or actually, I don't want to keep switching back and forth. But so in my code, you might have remembered that there was a server view, like there was like the template, the overall template of that had like the actual head section of the document. And if you think about it, one big difference between the server side and the client side is that the client side really just typically takes control over one tag within the body of the overall HTML document, whereas the server side is in control of the entire thing. So it's very normal on the server side to have logic to manipulate display different stuff in the head section, which you do need in various cases. Like there's a lot of stuff for AMP specification, for example, or different social sharing. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff where you need to add stuff in the head section of the document. So they had a service for setting the title, you know, early on in Angular 2 or whatever. But one thing that, I mean, we had like 1 million requests for was for modifying all the other tags in the head section. In fact, there was actually at one point a discussion to try to make control of the head section just like treat it as a component. And there's actually some problems with doing that, as a matter of fact. So instead, they have this new meta service. So like basically the approach right now is that to use services to control stuff outside, anything that's in the document, but outside of essentially the app tag that you need to control, like when you, for example, change routes. When you change routes, you have to change the title, you have to change the description, you have to, you know, if it's an AMP page, you have to add like some attributes in HTML, you know, tag, that type of thing. So this service does a large majority of that. Another thing that came out is the CLI. So this thing I am super, super excited for. Before, when you were working with Angular Universal, you basically were forced to, because really everyone should be using the CLI for their browser side app. I mean, it just helps so much. But there were certain Webpack configurations that were needed for Universal, and most of the time you had to eject Webpack config from Angular CLI in order to get it to work. But now Jason Jean, who's been doing amazing work for the Angular Universal team, basically built all of this. So this is another link I'll send you, where it is something that allows you to use the Angular CLI to actually run your Angular Universal app. And at the end of the day, really what that means is, like, when you actually run your code ngserve with just a browser-only app, it fires it up in just like a node, like HTTP server. It's like a very lightweight server, and it doesn't really do much on the server side at all. I mean, it's like super, super lightweight. Besides actually bootstrapping the server app, the Angular CLI implementation for Angular Universal will actually fire up Express, will manage the transition of state, all that type of stuff. So you do have to do, it is not as trivial as just firing, like doing ngserve with like -- universal or something. I think that they're working towards that, but it is a pretty straightforward process. There's just a couple steps you could follow that are on this page that I will link to. And then another cool thing that's happening is that, so early on, a year and a half ago, right when we were starting to build Angular Universal, almost immediately, Microsoft had already had a very close relationship with Google and the Angular team in developing Angular. That's why, that's how TypeScript became a first-class citizen. There's just a lot of collaboration there. And as part of that collaboration, Patrick and I were initially building Angular Universal in the beginning. We got hooked up with this one guy, Steve, from Microsoft, who was one of the someone very big on the Visual Studio and C# side, who basically implemented like an amazing implementation of having C# like in Visual Studio, doing a .NET app, and actually rendering, doing a server rendered view based off of your Angular code. And the way that worked in essence is that he had a .NET to JavaScript to like Node bridge that like there's basically inter-process communication. So it would like fire up like a node process, and then it would kind of like as a sub process and communicate with it and that type of thing. And it worked great. It was like fast. It was amazing that you can actually have a C# template that then has like a section that it defers this section to Angular Universal, and Angular Universal will kind of render that part of the app. So some other languages have been talking for a while about doing the same thing. So this is the first. It's still experimental, totally experimental, but this is further along than it's been in a while for Java. And there are people doing something similar for PHP and Python and Go. So I think those efforts are a little bit further behind than the Java one, but it's definitely realistic to think that at some point we will have implementations in all of those platforms. So that is pretty cool. Other than that, let me switch back here. Oops. Okay. Yeah, so other than that, the big things that are coming up that I didn't write down, or there isn't kind of a list, is this is just more from my head, is that there's a lot of work going on for data caching. So right now, when you run a Angular Universal, there are different asynchronous calls. Typically you might be getting data from your backend, your API or your database or whatever, and using that to what you display on the page. Currently, by default, it's going to make those calls twice. The server view will make those and get the data, and then the client view will get the data. You have the power. You can implement something yourself to get around that, which I'll explain in just 1 second. But we are working on a solution to make it just like right out of the box that it works really well. It's a complicated thing, and it's something that I say right out of the box. There is really no way for it just to work seamlessly, just because because of a lot of the edge cases, you actually don't want it to do that in a lot of cases. But we want to make it easy that it's opt-in to be able to reuse data. And basically the way that it works, if you guys want to implement yourself, is pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of when you make it, typically the way I've seen people implement, there's a lot of different implementations, but I'll explain one and you can kind of extrapolate your own. It's basically, most people will have a wrapper around their HTTP, like so HTTP or HTTP client in the newer version you use to make calls from your Angular app. And so typically people create a wrapper around that. And on the Universal app, they'll basically set it up so that any response from the HTTP calls, any data that comes back, they will put in some sort of data structure that they'll serialize and stick into their document. So you can inject the document. That's actually a token that you can inject in any of your in your services, and you can actually manipulate it. You can actually stick something in the document. So people will typically, create like a window dot blah, just put it on the window, stick it in there for the server side, and then the client side, you have like you have to build something again into your HTTP so that essentially like a service worker type of thing. So that instead of actually making the calls, it'll look to see if it's in your server view and use that instead for that initial. That's the basic, quick 2-minute way of describing it. I've seen other variations, but there'll be something similar to that will be accessible within hopefully the next month or so. And then the other thing is that there's been 2 really experimental things that I'll bring them up just because there's thought going around it, but there's no like definitive like it'll be done on this date, or even it might not even be done at all, to be honest. But there is some effort looking at hydration, so that the current implementation of using pre-boot and switching the buffers works really well, but there are some cases where hydration would be preferable, namely things like ads. So when you have a server view and you are displaying ads, you do not want to switch that out. You want, if you try to like re-render the page and with an ad there, it will have a not, the result is not desired because your ad will change and it just messes up your ability to make money off of those ads. So typically people have come up with other solutions for who try to use ads. But then the last thing I was going to mention is that there is this ability to stream responses from the server. So it's something that React is actually doing with React Fiber, the latest release. And it's part of the more recent HTML spec, or some of the, actually I forget which spec it is, but some of the more recent standards that have been coming out that allow a server, they have HTTP2, which kind of like sends like a bunch of stuff down at the same time. And then there's the streaming spec, which allows you to send a part of the page down and to just like, as you're finished rendering like pieces of the page just to start sending it down. So you don't basically wait until the app is stable before you send a response. You send it earlier. And in some use cases, not all, in some use cases, that actually does end up showing something to the user a lot faster. I mostly, where I've seen it really effective is in a case where you have part of the page that is essentially static and is rendered right away, and then the other part of the page that is pulling data and needs some processing and whatever. So that's something I think for longer term. I don't think that's going to be right away, but just a lot of cool stuff that is in the pipeline, I guess. And that's pretty much all that I had. Any questions?
I have a quick question. Did you say that there's a C# server-side rendering that's in the works, or is it just the Java side?
No, C# has been out there for a long time. C# one is very stable, in fact.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. No, there's if you look up on YouTube, Steve has given a number of talks at like Build and other like major Microsoft conferences about it. So it actually works really well. It works way better. It is like the most production ready of any of the different languages that are being worked on.
Cool, thanks.
Any other questions? Not only about server rendering. If you guys have any, do you guys have any questions about Angular? Like, there's a lot of stuff that I am a GD as well. So even if you have something bugging you about just Angular in general, I may know the answer.
He probably does.
Another question.
Yeah.
So on the server rendering, we have like page or required user credentials. How are we going to do that? We can't pass token or pass some authentication to it. What is recommended way from you?
So the question is authentication for server-side rendering. Do you pass tokens back and forth, or how do you do that?
I'm actually really glad you asked that. I had that in one of my presentations as like an important point, but I glossed over it. So thank you very much for asking that. Okay, so here's the deal, that different people have different philosophies on this. It is, I mean, for sure, it's possible to do whatever. So you can, typically what I've seen work, if you really have to use personalized rendering, like basically render the server view for a specific user. If you have to, typically it requires that your authentication credentials are in a cookie, and you can very easily set up in Express basically as when you're there's nothing built into Angular Universal for this, so it's basically a matter of when you in Express you have Express middleware typically where you kind of extract the credentials from the cookie, and for stuff like this you would either set those credentials or the user that results from it in a DI token that when Angular is being bootstrapped, or the zone. So like you can set, there's typically a zone around Angular, and you could set properties in it and then pull from the zone. Those are kind of, I mean, DI if at all possible. But that all said, if you can, if there's any way you can, I would avoid doing that. The thing that works a lot better is if you try to treat your server view as anonymous, that you think of it as there are parts of your page that require a user, like basically if there's a page that the entire page needs to be personalized and it's different for every user, then only do that page. That page should only be client-side rendered. Like that shouldn't be a server rendered page anyways, because you don't care about it being indexed and whatever. I mean, it's different for every user, right? But typically the bigger issue is that you have a page where most of it, like the main content, for example, is anonymous, and it is something you want search indexed and you want people to be able to share it or whatever. But there's like little personalization stuff throughout the page. Like in the upper right-hand corner, you have the user's icon, and somewhere else you have something else and whatever. So the thing that works the best for that is that the server view, completely anonymous, and in those personalized sections on the server view, you basically have it as like either a totally blank space or just like an icon that has to be filled in. And then when the client view kicks in, you know, it basically, and you see this in a lot of different sites, that the main content is there and it's like just stays there. And then those personalization things, then they kind of like fill in once the client side fills in. So that doesn't work for everybody, but that, in my opinion, is the best setup, because when you have your server view anonymous and not, you don't have to render it differently for different users, then that allows you to be more aggressive about caching. You can, you know, there's different levels of caching. Like, I mean, there's so many different ways you can cache, either data side cache in your middleware, like Redis for some just like specific calls, or what's edge caching, which is like, you know, once the thing's been rendered and you're like actually essentially caching the end HTML in different places, like on CDNs around the world. In fact, I would even take it a step further and say that if at all possible, you should actually try to, I've changed my thinking on this over the years, but my current belief is that if at all possible, your first option should be to see if you can statically generate your entire server view rendered your site at build time. That doesn't work for everything, you know, for a variety of different reasons. But if at all possible, there's a lot of benefits. And that doesn't mean that you have static HTML that stays the same. You know, typically the implementations that I've seen work really well is essentially you can have like a background process that is regenerating pages and updating them periodically or whatever. But the reason why doing that is that when you do that, you kind of totally get rid of potential server time, runtime issues. You're able to serve up the static HTML on really low cost CDNs, you know, around the world. So like basically you can have a super high performance site for very low cost. So it's not for everybody, but that right now, just to give you a sense, if you go to gethuman.com, we haven't gone that far yet. So we actually do the step right before it, where it is, we do have Express that's generating it at runtime, but we use Cloudflare to edge cache. So Cloudflare essentially is doing a lot of that caching of the HTML that's generated, and we clear that out and whatever. But for the next iteration, I'm actually experimenting now with if it's workable to try to just generate the static HTML build time, deploy it out to static CDNs, and go for that. And again, that doesn't work if you do need some dynamic, like you can't get past needing that dynamic server side rendering, but if you can.
Going once, going twice. All right, I think that's it, Jeff. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Cool. Cheers. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff's in Boston, so it's like 11 p.m. there. So we really thank you for being up late. If you have a family, thank them for letting you talk to sleep.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, if you're in Portland, come say hi. We'd love to
I
meet
will
you.
definitely. You know what? I definitely have to get out soon. I love Portland, like I said, so I'll be out there soon, and I will definitely look you guys up. All right.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thanks, Jeff.
Okay.
Have a great night.
Have a good one, guys.